Hello! Right then, so I'm going to start this off apparently with the burn in front of me. I do not know how that happened, but hey ho. Refresh. Hey! Welcome to the Long Patrol, the recorded video version of this, Patron 71. And this is going up on the Saturday. And, well, there might be a few more videos coming soon. I'm going to try and catch up with all the comment response videos I really should do. But I'm also in the middle of writing a lot of stuff. So, comment response videos sort of, I usually do one a week. I might get more than a week to cover some of the Christmas ones. But they're sort of things which I do when I am not busy doing other things. Because I don't really feel like I'm giving you anything extra in them. It's just I'm just responding to your comments, which I enjoy doing, but it doesn't feel like I'm doing as much as I should be for a video for some reason. Now, of course, shameless book plug going on. Always doing a shameless book plug. Mainly because it's honestly the books being sold and all the other things like that are how I am funding the next generation of books and the next things I'm doing, so I literally do run the kind of personal economy where all the money that comes in goes out to do more history. Which I can afford to do because I have no dependents other than my dogs. Which is a good for the history way to be. Kind of depressing when you think of it that way, but it's good for the history. It is good for the history if your only dependents are your dogs. It's also good for their biscuit supply and might explain why there are quite so many bags of biscuits all around my office. No paid for product placement, but they do enjoy these Bonio ones. And you can buy them in the 25 kilogram box. I know, that's how I buy them from Amazon. When you've got two dogs who are both led by their stomachs, you bulk order biscuits. But, well, French naval aviation. If we go back to the question, why did the French Navy not more fully embrace carrier aviation after World War I? And this basically starts from the point of view that the French Navy has a history of going for every bit of new technology going. If we consider it with the Juno Colt, the entire reality of that coming in was to adapt naval warfare to the new technologies which were available. The Whitehead-style torpedo, i.e. not the torpedo mine, the Whitehead-style torpedo, which goes zoom. And then you hear a big boom. Well, you know, they've done that. They invested in submarines. They still, throughout the interwar, maintain one of the best, most vibrant, invested in, invigorative submarine arms of any nation in the world. Prior to the First World War, they have one of the best submarine fleets. Prior to the First World War, they had one of the best submarine fleets, and then during the interwar period, they keep it up, and they have really good quality submarines. In fact, the Royal Navy is almost more paranoid about those when the French have the issues they do in World War II and basically get knocked out of the war than they are the surface ships, because the French submarines are considered that good. The Royal Navy knows how good they are. They've been conducting exercises against them. And then we've got their destroyers, they've got the continental torpedoes, they've got all sorts of really cool ideas. And they're even arguably the first nation to really take the plunge and build the fast battleship. You can go back to the Queen Elizabeths and what they were planned to be versus what they came out as. You can go back to some of the designs that the Royal Navy considered instead of building the Nelrods, the F3 versions, etc., which were faster. So the fast battleship's been around a while. But really, you can argue that the first proper fast battleship is the Dunkirks. They are the first proper one, which is everyone going in and diving in, and that's what they're building. They're building fast battleships. And those are good ships. And those are necessary ships. Yes, they're a risk, but they're a necessary ship. Problem is, in contrast to all that, you have the fact that French naval aviation is, largely speaking, one aircraft carrier, a seaplane tender or two, depending on the time period, and a load of seaplanes. And basically, we could number the number of aircraft on. Well, 27 aircraft were on the burn. So I wouldn't like to say a couple of our own two hands and feet, one person's hands and feet, but probably, I don't know, the number of unsticky fingers in a nursery class after break time at school. If anything, if school is anything like when I was there, you know, there was always various lovely treats, etc. in break time when you're in nursery, and pretty much everyone had sticky fingers. Everyone, you know, out of a group of 40, 50 kids, there might have been, I don't know, 3 dozen fingers which were not sticky. And that would be about right for the number of aircraft which the French were actually operating at any one time in terms of their naval forces. Some people probably at this point respond, but they had a lot of land-based aircraft. Well, A, they still had problems keeping them all operational. And yes, I am adding this on another day because I've seen some of the comments on the live. But there is also a problem with land-based air and focusing on land-based air in terms of your naval air arm. Naval aviation at its truest point is about working with ships. And whilst land-based air will do a lot to develop your aerial tactics and your aerial capabilities, integrating with your fleet and your force and understanding your capabilities for therefore of that, it doesn't really do so. In fact, where you can almost say that land-based aircraft, especially in the Mediterranean, for the Navy terms, become almost something they want to not talk about, because if they talk about it too much, it could be a threat to their submarine forces and their destroyer forces. It could be a threat to their wider force structure. So that is a problem for them. And this is what leads to a situation which can best be described, which is kind of pathetic. For starters, they have more allowance than just the burn. They could have built another carrier. They could have built one at any time. And when you consider the burn straddles the line enough that it can be considered experimental because of the fact of when it was launched, then you could say that's a good reason to build the burn. Well, there's not really much effort going on. So France drops the ball. But it doesn't drop the ball on other things. And the question is why? Well, I would put it down to momentum. Sounds strange. And no, I'm not talking about various political action groups around the world which have coined that phrase. No. You see, an organisation grows by one of 3 things: building upon its institutional memory, cultural awareness in the wider population, and impetus to change. Impetus to change often comes from momentum. And it often comes as much from without the organisation as within the organisation. For example, if we consider with Japan and the Imperial Japanese Army versus the Imperial Japanese Navy, one of the reasons why both sides actually develop aviation as much as they do is competition between the two organisations. It's terrible. It's tearing Japan apart, but it does push them forward. It's similarly in the US. Between the US Army Air Corps and the US Navy, there is a competition over aviation. And there's also a competition with view to Japan and the reality of operating in the Pacific. In Britain, you would think that because of the scenario where the Fleet Air Arm is actually controlled by the Royal Air Force and is part of the Royal Air Force for much of the interwar period until the INSCIP Award, it would start. I mean, there was no competition, but actually there is, because the Royal Navy, in many ways, forced to try and think of reasons to justify it reacquiring the fleet air arm so it can control this vital part of itself, especially once it learns of the Air Ministry's war plans. Please note, I always draw a line between sort of the Air Ministry, the political wing, and governmental wing of the Royal Air Force and the Royal Air Force. They are in sometimes two completely different organisations in the way they act. And even people will change their views on things depending on which part of the service they're in. In that, the Air Ministry itself becomes basically Bomber Command expanded and ignores their own fighter command and their own all sorts of things, as well as the Fleet Air Arm. So, please. They are captured by a particularly attractive philosophy of warfare. And it makes sense in the legacy of World War One. It's all part of the legacy of World War One and the horror of that war. But because the Fleet Air Arm becomes this cause of friction between the Navy and the Royal Air Force, and Navy and the Air Ministry over it, the Navy is constantly having to think about how it would use its Fleet Air Arm to justify it having its Fleet Air Arm, and to justify the RAF not taking all its Fleet Air Arm off its carriers, loading its carriers up with their aircraft, so they would take those out to the Far East, and then they'd come back for the Navy's aircraft. That was actually one of the war plans. I can't think why the Royal Navy was not impressed with that idea. To be fair, Sir Thomas Inskip also wasn't, and to be fair, I think the Chief of the Air Staff at the time, when he heard that was someone's actual plan that they'd actually mentioned to the Minister as of their strategic plan, probably went, "You absolute dolt. You absolute dolt. You... That's just giving the Navy their own argument that we have no idea what naval aviation is for." But the thing is, the short answer is the burn, because it is so not good at its job that it's so relatively confining, and only having one means they can't generate the institutional knowledge from her which would provide internal impetus to change and evolve. And because of all these other factors, there is no impetus externally from their own political will to evolve, and from within their own navy, that they don't. That this incomplete Normandy-class battleship conversion, with a top speed of 21.5 knots, thanks to a single steam turbine set turning 2 shafts, and 2 triple expansion steam engines still turning a shaft each. A system which was put in place because of the logic that the triple expansion engines would allow for longer range, while the turbines would allow for more power when you needed high speed for operating aircraft. Oh, Lord. 21.5 knots is not high speed, not by 1927 when she's commissioned, and it wasn't even when she was laid down in 1914. So, goodness knows what happened there. And other navies are achieving longer range of operation, i.e. greater than 6,500 nautical miles at 10 knots, with turbines in the same period. It's a whole discussion, but basically there is a whole lot of decisions made about her that reflect the fact that the people making decisions keep changing. And they do keep changing. So, the burn is both caused by the issues and the cause of the issues, which really do undermine the development of French naval aviation. Saying that, it's not the starting point. The starting point is the legacy of World War One. Those are the figures. 1,697,000 to 1,737,800, or between 4.3 and 4.4% of the total population, dead. Think about that. Let me put it this another way. That means for roughly every 24 people, one of them is dead. Total wounded, with a wound which is a debilitating or disabling wound, 4,266,000, or 10.8% of the population. Fun times, really. Let's put that another way. Roughly for every 9 people, one of them has that. One of them has either a disabling or debilitating wound. And then on top of that, you can probably add another 15 to 30% have psychological trauma of varying degrees as a legacy of the war. And the vast majority of the population with that are your prime age population, your prime working population, also the population you're probably going to draw your politicians from, your national leadership, your local leadership, your senior naval officers, your senior engineers, everyone. It's not good. It's not good. And sorry if I've just startled you. I think I hit the mic with this coming down. How does the population get over that? Well, to be honest, there's still a legacy going on to this day. If you look at the French population census and density and its records, and there are still noticeable blips you can see where the population that would have come from this population, i.e. their reproduction, didn't take place, and you can see the gaps. But there's also a huge loss of institutional memory and of potential. And you have a further problem, and this is a problem felt by all the nations after World War I. Who are usually the first people to volunteer in a war? Let me put it this another way. Who volunteers first for something? The altruistic people or the selfish people? Now, this is not saying they are selfish to an extent that they are bad or nasty, no. But where you are on that spectrum from altruistic to selfish, it's a spectrum. Some people are really, as we all know, have an actual disorder and are selfish to the point of the nth degree. But also some people can be altruistic to the nth degree, and it's a spectrum. So the people who care about their country, who care about the people of their country, who were more likely to go into national service with pride and go into the sort of the government work with the idea of building up the country and sort of trying to get the most out of it they could, they're usually the people who volunteer first, which means they're in the war for longest, which means they as a percentage tend to suffer most. I'm not saying all of them die, they do not. There are plenty to go round, but the pool of them goes down. And that pool takes time to replenish. And for countries which have 2 world wars and fight the whole way through both of them, that pool can get really, really damaged. And you can put some of the very bad short-term decisions of the 1960s in the UK, etc., down to perhaps not having the critical mass of people in all levels of government who were closer to the altruistic end of the spectrum than the selfish end of the spectrum. And please note, I'm not saying people are bad or not are good. I'm good or bad. I'm not saying that. But it's a case of using selfish as a catch-all for people who are motivated by perhaps themselves and things that are good for things that would be necessarily of benefit for them, versus altruistic as people who are motivated by doing things for others. And yes, that doesn't. Some of the people who are motivated doing things for others and altruistic are also not very nice, and some of the people who are very self-motivated and focused entirely on themselves are actually also very nice. I know I'm explaining this a bit more, but you need this bit of psychology to understand what comes to an extent next. The problem is, you have all this damage done. You have all these people gone. And you have all these people damaged and not able to work as effectively as they used to, or communicate as effectively as they used to, or live up to the potential they might have had pre the damage and the horror of World War One. And the trouble is, you then have the fight over how to build a land fit for heroes. It's a nice idea. It's the generation of leaders who were in power during the war and before the war, trying to, well, some could say they were trying to hold on to power by making the best case for themselves because of what they were offering, and others would say living up to the side of the bargain which they'd struck with the future generations which went off to fight the war. The trouble is, for France, this doesn't go well. In the same period, Britain would have 5 prime ministers spread over 8 ministries, i.e. from January 1918 to December 1939. France would have 19 prime ministers spread over... Well, that doesn't look the right slide. That is the right slide. Over 34 ministries from January 1918 to December 1939. So, in 21 years, they have 34 different ministries and 19 different people as Prime Minister. Now, that's a very quick turnover. And it's a symptom of the French form of parliamentary government in their republic at this point. The president doesn't have the power the modern president has. That's a legacy of Charles de Gaulle. And his insistence that the president should have more power. When it comes to internal government decisions and appointments, etc., the prime ministers had the power in the 1920s and 1930s. And there are literally 19 of them who serve in that role, and they are spread over 34 ministries. So yes, many of them do multiple times in service, but let's be honest, you're not going to get stability. The example I will give, once more, is the preparation for the London Naval Treaty of 1930. Okay, so the London Naval Treaty, 1930. Preparation for that starts in... let's be honest, probably early 1929, January 1929, under Raymond Poincaré. Now, in July 1929, he's replaced by Aristide Briand of the Republican Socialist Party. In November 1929, he is replaced by André Tardieu of the Democratic Alliance. In February 1930, he is replaced by Camille Chautemps of the Radical Socialist Party. In March, he is replaced by André Tardieu, returning for the Democratic Alliance. And in December 1930, he is replaced by Theodore Stieg of the Radical Socialist Party. But don't worry, he's only in power until the 27th of January 1931, when he is replaced by Pierre Naval who's an independent, and he manages to stay in power from January 1931 to February 1932. I'm still not sure how Pierre does that, but Pierre is the gentleman in the middle of this row. So, you know, you can see him there. And seems to be a fairly effective politician. But the trouble is, he comes back and occupies the post again during the German occupation. And so has a bit of a mixed legacy, let's say. And there are, well, some estimate there's a dozen biographies of him. I would say there's a few, there seems to be more than that of him going around. But an interesting gentleman. Not sure I agree with his politics. In fact, fairly sure I don't agree with his politics. But the fact he managed to stay in power for that long is something. It's certainly something in the French system. So, you get a lot of churn. Okay. Well, this is going to be reflected in the next level of leadership which a navy has to look to for its political leadership. They're French ministers marine of the interwar period. 18! So, actually, one less than prime ministers. Managing over 23 terms. So, obviously, some managed to actually outlast their prime ministers. Which is both a good thing, but still, if we think about it, we're talking roughly over a 21-year period, there were 23 terms. So the average term is less than a year. That is trying to go for an average term of, I don't know, 8 months. Maybe less. It's not good for stability. And it means, for example, the Burn, nice picture courtesy of World Warships here. Well, it means for the Burn, when we consider she's laid down in 1914, a long time before the Georges Leguz becomes minister, but she's launched in 1920, in April 1920. So by the time she's launched, Georges Leguz has been replaced by Adolphe Landry. Okay? Then she's commissioned in December 1927. So let's go down that list. Landry is replaced by Gabriel Gustal, who is replaced by Flamius Roberti, who is replaced by Maurice Bokanowski, who is replaced by Désiré Ferré, who is replaced by Jacques-Louis Duncel, who is replaced by Émile Borel, who is replaced by Georges Leguz again, who is replaced by René Renault, who is then replaced by Georges Leguz again, who's back for her commissioning. So, that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 different terms of naval during her time from, actually no, this is halfway through her time being sort of laid down before being launched, from being sort of halfway being built to being actually commissioned. Think about that from a decision-making process, right? Who has budget signing off power? Who has the authority, once the budget's been allocated, to make the decisions? And if the minister changes day by day, one of the interesting things that came up was that, of course, a number of people, probably views to modern government and their perceptions of modern government, where in the chat on the live we're asking about corruption. It's very difficult to have ministers who are corrupt when they are not the same minister in charge the next day. It's very difficult to bribe someone, because if you bribe them, great, that you've bought them, but then they're not in post the next day, so you then have to turn around and bribe the next one again. It gets very, very expensive. It's almost easier, rather than bribing them, to just change them and hope the next one decides they're going to change everything their predecessor decided, because that's the instinct of any politician. The moment they get into power, must change all the decisions made by my predecessor so I can show I have made the power and I have the power to make decisions. And this has an impact on the burn, but it also has an impact on the wider French Navy. Because where are they going to go for their stability at this point? Where are they going to find their stability? If you've got constant changes in government, if you've got constant changes in minister, you have constant changes in foreign policy and budget priority. You have constant changes in what they want to do with a navy and constant changes in how they want to organize a navy. It's one of the problems which we've seen more recently in Britain and other democracies around the world, as the importance of the Ministry of Defence has dropped in those countries in the period after the supposed end of the Cold War to really the current day. Minister of Defence has become more and more a post that you hand off to someone as something to keep them busy. It's a good post to park a young prospective minister, a young minister, before you take them onto a bigger role, foreign policy or chancellery, or to park a key ally who you don't want to give anything really important, because defence didn't matter. And this meant there was a constant churn through of ministers. And that's a problem. Because, yes, I know, a recent German defence minister has said, I'm not a strategist. You're not supposed to be. But, however, what happens when you go into defence as a department, or if you go into foreign policy or the treasury or any of the big departments, the people who are experts within that department will sit you down. They will have conversations with you. They will try and explain things to you, give you a lexicon, a phraseology, so you can understand what's being said in the room. And they'll probably give you a reading list and things to go and read. These will be both briefing documents and sometimes some books. I know the latter is not always the most popular. But it will take time to go through all those things and come up to speed. This is why the terms of service of a minister are so important. The longer they're in their department, the longer they serve within that department, the more and more knowledgeable that department they get. They don't become strategists if they're defence, or they don't become economists if they're chancellors. What they do become is capable of understanding when the strategists and the economists, etc., in their departments are telling them the truth or are trying to blow smoke because they don't have any better solution. An experienced minister is both an advantage to their department, as they're better able to understand what they need, and a problem for their department because they are better able to ask questions when they think the department is going wrong. When you've got a churn like this, when you have a churn like this going on, some of these ministers won't have managed to get up to speed at all within their period. They will have just maybe issued some of their first orders, met some people, and have started. Some of them will have just got actually to the point at which they're actually knowledgeable enough that they should be in the post. And others, well, they might have slightly more time there. Especially the people who repeat. They're useful, the people who repeat. But, let's be honest, Georges Leguz, he repeats. He does it 3 times. I know, 4 times. And that's great. But each time, he's having to come in and learn again what the current threats and the current capabilities are in a period of great technological change, in a period of great evolution and of great strategic change. Another thing I have to point out to people quite often is that in the 1920s, Britain wasn't worrying about Germany. They were worrying about Japan and they were worrying about Italy. It's the same with France in the 1920s. Yes, they're building the Maginot Line, but that's because of the legacy of World War One, and I'll be talking about the Maginot Line in a bit. But Germany isn't a big threat in the 1920s. It's not even a big threat at the beginning of the 1930s. Let's be honest, Hitler coming to power doesn't suddenly make Germany a big threat. It takes the time to build up an armed forces to see if he's actually going to build up an armed forces or if he's just going to make statements about it. Let's be honest, he wouldn't be the first dictator in human history to shout about how big he's going to build his armed forces and then doesn't, or the first dictator in history to shout about how big he's going to build his armed forces and then award so many contracts to his cronies that those armed forces are papier-mâché tigers and frankly no one's worried about it. It's not unusual. So, yes, they become on the register of threats in the 1930s and they grow from there, but they're not. In the 1920s and for most of the 1930s, the Royal Navy, who are they pointing guns at occasionally? It's the Japanese, and they're pointing guns right back. They don't fire at each other, because neither wants to pull that trigger and start that war as the offensive nation, and that period, but they're pointing guns at each other. Yes, they also have a very good diplomatic relationship going on. Lots of conversations, lots of legacies of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. But it's a real world. It's the real politics of it. Which is why simplifying it and going to people going, well, people going, well, all they had to do was think about Germany. Well, no, they didn't. A minister doesn't have to think about just one nation. They also don't have to think about just the scenario of Japan. There's all sorts of other things over the world that the French Minister Marine has to consider. And if we go back to something I often talk about, if we talk about the London Naval Treaty of 1930, well, if we consider it, Georges Legouis is part of the preparation for that. He's in power from 23rd of July 1926 to the 21st of February 1930, so he's really built up his experience at that point. But then in 1930, there is Albert Sarraut, there is Jacques-Louis Dumoncel, and Albert Sarraut back again. And then it's Charles Dumont who gets the problem of actually implementing that treaty. Wait a minute, you've had that many prime ministers change and that many ministers change in that period. And then we have the French commanders-in-chief. Well, Vice Admiral Henry Saloon manages to serve twice in the role. That's always good in the period. But you'll notice the French Navy is not like the US Navy. Let me explain that. For the US Navy, for a long period, they didn't like having admirals. And then when eventually they did have admirals after the Civil War, they were all rear admiral, and then they were given promotions based on their posting. So they'd be an admiral because they're in post, in a certain post, but they could be reduced down to rear admiral because that was their substantive rank. They were always acting or provost in their rank, not actually promoted to it. The French Navy don't do that. The French Navy do promote you to your rank. So think about that. The French Navy have actual full admirals going around, and yet their commanders-in-chief in charge of the Navy, the Chief of Staff of the French Navy, for this period, barring Admiral Francois Darlan, are all Vice Admirals. They're all Vice Admirals. Could be worse, they could be Contre Admirals, but they're all Vice Admirals. They've got to weigh into national debates with ministers who don't know much about what they're talking about, and prime ministers who are barely in post before they change, with full marshals and generals for the French army in terms of debating for funding, and they've also got to try and make decisions about the future of their navy. And remember, these men are just a guard. And if you think about it, again, there is actually a quicker pace of change amongst the French admirals than there is amongst the Royal Navy. So the Royal Navy First Sea Lords, they are more senior in rank. They're all full admirals. In fact, most of them are admirals of the fleet. And they are also, in the reality of things, far more political heavyweights. Now, yes, this does reflect the French naval position and the fact that strategically and geostrategically the French Navy after the First World War becomes an add-on to the Royal Navy in some of the regards and perspectives of some of the French politicians. But it's not really a nice position for the French Navy when it comes to trying to develop something new. They had the legacy of the submarine service from the First World War and the prior to the First World War. So they already had the infrastructure and the ideas developed. So they could continue that and make the case quite easily because here it is. We've got this thing. With their battleships, they could show how effective their battleships were in the First World War and go, we need something a lot better than this in future. And I often wonder if the reason the Dunkirks are quite so good and the Richelieus become sort of improved Dunkirks is because the French are trying to make up for the fact that their World War I generation of battleships kind of were not that good. When I say kind of were not that good, that's me being incredibly charitable to them. The poor ships do not reflect the quality of engineering that a nation like France is capable of. For all its potential of being an agricultural nation with industry attached on various places, the reality is France has always been quite a technologically innovative nation. Yes, they haven't always been good at producing things, and especially with ships, actually standardizing them often proves a very difficult process involving, again, a significant amount of political heavyweight power. Again, a problem for ministers and for chiefs of staff. And then we have this, another legacy of World War I, the Maginot Line. The lines around Verdun had worked. The lines around Torres Vedras had worked. The French government decide that even in better, improved lines that would include all of the territories they'd reacquired after World War I was over, would be the best defence. And the thing is, these Maginot Lines, yeah, they work in the places where they are, but they suck up the national defence debate. The defence debate no longer becomes about anything else. It's kind of like the Cold War effect on the British defence procurement and a lot of other nations' defence procurement, in that everything was focused on the Central Front and fighting in Germany because that was where the big focus was, the big debate was about. And so that made out-of-area operations and spending on things like navies, etc., difficult to justify because that wasn't part of the main debate. And the main debate tends to be what's the debate which filters through to the public. So if everything is focused on the Maginot Line, if that's the big centre point of your defence and the big centre point of your debate, then everything becomes about that in the national conscious. And again, when you have politicians changing over quickly, what do they have? They have a surface understanding of defence. Yes, some of them had fought in World War I. Yes, some of them had been big parts of it, but that it gives you even more of a problem. Because if you have a minister who's fought in a particular branch, in a particular action, they can go one of two ways. And think about this, because you will have met enough people in your life, if you're listening to this, and you will understand what I'm about to say. A veteran can go one of two ways. Either they relate everything to their own and all procurement and all decisions to their own personal experience, and anything which wasn't of use to them in their own personal scenario is therefore not viable and not worth spending money on, because their own experience is their entire prism of war. Or they go the other way, and they think their prism of war is hopefully never going to happen again, and therefore, because it was so horrific, therefore they want to ignore the experience and lessons of them that they themselves learned, and are chasing everyone else's ideas. Now, you do sometimes get the rare unicorn who's actually halfway between those two positions, and it's probably the perfect example you can get for a minister of defense. But that's a kind of unicorn, because humans, if we think about them, whilst we're not 0-1 binary machines, tend to be very rarely on the center line of anything. We always tend to lean. We're always going to be slightly inclined one way or the other. Now, if you have good advisors and you're prepared to listen to them, then your personal biases can be ameliorated, but they will still come through. And this is another problem for the French when it comes to their defense secretaries and the ministers of marine. What their experiences of, what is their understanding is, and what their views on exact naval forces and naval utility are. We should also remember that during World War I, the French Navy had not been absent without leave. The French Navy had been very much part of it. They had been part of the anti-submarine operations in the Bay of Biscay. They had been patrolling in the Channel. They had been part of the convoy operations. They had been a valiant part of the Mediterranean campaign. They were critical to pulling off, well, the attempts on Gallipoli, etc. They were a big part of global operations. Yes, they were always second place to the Royal Navy, but there again, that's the scenario they're in. They have to be second place to the Royal Navy because the Royal Navy is massive compared to them. It's kind of unfair to compare the two. In France, they have massive land borders, and so they invest in their army. The Royal Navy has the advantage of being able to send people to the beach and go, look out. That is our defense in depth. That blue stuff, bluey greeny stuff you see frothing about with white stuff on top, that's our defensive depth. That is what we have. It's not always agreed with, and yes, it's certainly been vented as an argument since the Battle of Britain, because again, people focus on the air defence, but actually the combination of the two together makes a very good case for the Navy and the Air Force, especially when they do gang up together. That's probably why the Army in Britain sometimes feels it's a bit outmanoeuvred by the other two. Now, the French position is further complicated by Washington. Italy is a Mediterranean power. Yes, they have some empire in Africa, etc., but they do not have much of a global empire. France has quite a global empire, but France and Italy get tagged together on the same level. Now, for the French, there is an advantage to this. It means that the Italians are limited to the same size as them. But there's also a disadvantage, because if we just look at France itself alone, it has a Mediterranean and an Atlantic coast. Oh, sugar. Italy just has a Mediterranean coast. They can afford to concentrate their fleet in the Mediterranean. The French can't. And the French have need of formations and positions in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific and the South China Sea because of all their territories. There is often a point in me which sort of thinks that there are some negotiators negotiating at the Washington Treaty, who then set the basis for negotiations under the London Treaty and the London treaties which come afterwards, who are living in a bit of a cuckoo land, in that they honestly do believe the fact that the First World War was originally called by some the Great War, by others the War to End All Wars, others still the 1914-18 War, but the War to End All Wars philosophy. This war was so horrific, we shall never repeat the tremendous tumult of having it again, of repeating it. Yeah, it makes sense. You don't really need... You only need defence in name only if war's never going to happen again, do you? That's all you need. Enough force to look like you're defended. Enough force to, satisfy the public that you actually have a navy and you have the security. But still, France did get 60,000 tons in the standard. And then, under London, well, the French and the Italians under London are in quite a good position, because the London Treaty doesn't really limit them any more than the others did. They still have the limitations on terms of what a heavy cruiser, etc. is and what a light cruiser is, but whilst the British, the Americans and Japanese had to accept limitations in terms of their numbers of cruisers and their numbers of destroyers and total tonnage, the French didn't. And whilst gun caliber was restricted on submarines, the already constructed French submarines were allowed to retain their 8-inch guns. So the French really get away with not much of a limitation. They can build as many destroyers, they can build as many cruisers as they like, as long as they keep them within the treaty limits of the limits for a heavy cruiser, the limits for a light cruiser. That's fairly nice. But what's the French Navy do? They build the Dunkirks, which are good ships, but there's a problem here. You've got a 60,000 ton limit on aircraft carriers, 175,000 ton limit on capital ships in standard displacement, and the Dunkirk class, as cool as they are, they're not massive in terms of their displacement. They are 26,500 tons in standard, but they are capable of 29.5 knots. And they do have a range of 7,850 nautical miles at 15 knots and 2,450 nautical miles at 28.5 knots. So they're pretty darn capable long-range vessels. Now, at this point, if you'd been talking to the Royal Navy in sort of in this period, the Royal Navy would turn around and go, well, yes, we're looking at linking up our faster carriers with our faster capital ships, i.e. our battle cruisers, and those are going to be the core of our hunting groups for dealing with surface raiders. And that's a real shortage. And that's also part of what the French are supposed to do in the future in any major war. They're supposed to actually backfill for the Royal Navy to an extent in terms of providing these hunter groups or providing the force to go to help out the Far East. Each of which a fast carriers would have been useful. The French could have built a couple of fast carriers based on Dunkirks to partner up the Dunkirks, and then they would have had a couple of task groups. After all, the burn is only 22,000 and I think it's 1 ton? Or is it 22,501 tons? No, it's 22,501 tons. Yes, standard. So they theoretically have 37,499 tons left. I'm fairly certain that no one would really be that annoyed with them if they went 1 ton over their limit. Considering what other nations are doing, they could probably get away with it. And then we get to the 1936 treaty, and again, no aircraft carriers. Yes, there's the Joffre class. Someone's going to point them out to me and go, but the French were looking at the Joffre class. They were. And the Joffre class were laid down in 1938. So, 2 years after the Second London Naval Treaty, November 1938. They've got 3 Rickaloos under construction at this point, or in various stages of it. They've got the 2 Dunkirks constructed. So you've got 5 capital ships constructed. You can then go, well, hang on, is this a leeching of the Royal Navy? Well, the Royal Navy is not. The idea of the Royal Navy being a battleship navy is something which comes up quite regularly, but it's not. In fact, they're quite a carrier-orientated navy in some regards in this period. After all, their first Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, Admiral Henderson, goes on to become the 3rd Sea Lord in his next posting after being Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, the first ever in that post. And his first process he starts off doing as his 3rd Sea Lord is pretty much building Ark Royal, and then going on from that to build the Illustrious class, Order Unicorn, which lays down the basis for the light fleet carriers, and working on the designs which will provide the basis for everything up to Indefatigables. That's quite a lot of carrier construction going on. Yes, it's of a different style than you've got in America and Japan, but it reflects the British geostrategic position versus the French, versus the Japanese, and the American one. So what is going on here? Okay, well, we have a lack of impetus, but do we have another reason going on? Because the British are building carriers, but the French are leaving it incredibly late. Especially if you're thinking about War of Japan. Well, again, we can go back to the burn and the wonderful lifts and how they cycle quite so slowly, and the fact that they lift things up from. Well, that lift is designed so instead of putting clamshell doors, which they've used for the other 2 lifts, which are really not a good idea in their own way, not a good idea, but they do work. The French look at various other forms of lifts, and they do this lift which lifts up like that, and it has a top. Okay. And it has a bottom which sort of goes down to the hanger, so you can roll it straight on and then lift it up, but that goes up, blocks everything. But don't worry, underneath that lift there is also a gantry system which connects into the lower hangar, where they can wheel aircraft along on this gantry system, so they're basically pushing them on rails from ceiling, kind of like a downward hanging monorail, onto the lift and lift it up. And by the way, that's repeated on all 3 lifts. The 2 lifts further back are the bigger lifts, but they have clamshell doors and take really a long time to cycle. The forward lift is the small lift for fighters, and that takes minutes to cycle. Basically, the entire system is really, really overly engineered. Someone was. I have no idea sometimes what they're trying to design, because if we consider the closest scenario I often put to this vessel would be HMS Eagle. Okay? Because she's another converted battleship. She's converted Admiralty Latour. She displaces 22,200 tons in standard, so she is 300 tons less. She has a top speed of 24 knots. Not exactly powerful, but she is based on 4 shafts powered by 4 geared steam turbine sets. And she has a range of 4,800 nautical miles at 16 knots. Okay? They can carry remarkably similar aircraft. The Burn would carry 27, the Eagle could carry up to 30. between 25 and 30 depending on the actual air group attached. Now the thing is, once we start looking at the Eagle and we start considering her aviation facilities and how she was converted, she has two lifts. This is, of course, Eagle. And, well, she's otherwise very similar. So, one of the questions you have to ask when you consider that the Eagle is converted and commissioned 1924, she's acquired 1918, commissioned as an aircraft carrier 1924. She's actually been in service 3 years when the Bern is commissioned. And she's not the only aircraft carrier the Royal Navy's had. So, what happened to the French in terms of their carrier development? Why did they come with the Bern? Well, for starters, it does start back with the Normandy class battleship. It really does. They're just an interesting vessel and an interesting design. But in the case of the Bern, I think the French were honestly trying to try out too many technologies. They had so many ideas. Oh, yes, we'll put in a fighter lift. Put in this type of lift, that type of lift. They had 3 different types of lift on the ship. They're all powered by electric motors, but they're 3 different types of lift. One for fighters, one for reconnaissance aircraft, and one for bombers. You're pretty much turning your ship into lift specific for aircraft. And that makes it incredibly complicated to organize your hangar. That makes it incredibly difficult to run your ship in terms of your hangar, because you basically have to turn your whole ship the whole way down into silos. You've got your fighter silo forward. You've got your reconnaissance silo center. You've got your torpedo aircraft silo aft. And that's a good way to end up in trouble, because if there's an issue with one of the lifts, well, then you've got problems, and you've got to start moving aircraft around on that gantry stuff, which hangs from both the upper hangar, which is sort of the flight operational hangar, and the lower hangar, which is the maintenance repair hangar. Although I do have to say, I do like the idea of a maintenance repair hangar down below. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I wish more modern ships had it, because I think it would make things more viable. Ark Royal sort of had that, and so did a few other carriers designed in the period. I think having the lower hangar, I would be tempted to call it a flex deck these days under modern terminology, would be a sensible addition to most aircraft carrier designs if they had it when built in with them. But life doesn't happen that way, and no one listened to me. So, Bern is inefficient to operate aircraft on, can never really operate a full amount of aircraft, and is, well, let's be honest, would you want to land with that gantry high above the flight deck? No. So you cannot be simultaneously lifting aircraft up and down and recovering or having aircraft take off. Ouch. And then we have the Joffre class. There are various designs going around for the Joffre class, but all I can say is they needed to learn more lessons from the Bern. Or rather, they needed to learn more lessons from the people they were learning lessons from. Because it's sort of an American-style build, but orientated around a British-style form of operations, because it makes sense for if you're operating with the British, but also if you're operating in the Mediterranean. One of the factors for the British in terms of going for the constant pace of air operations rather than the Alpha Strike, which the Americans and Japanese focused on, was because the British were thinking fighting the Pacific against the Japanese was a big possibility. But under those scenarios, A, they wanted to fight at night if they could, and B, then they would have a multi-carrier force and they would launch a big multi-carrier strike. They'd be sort of arranged the squadrons and then launch them together, and then range another squadron on each flight deck and launch them together, and etc. So that's how they would sort of conduct the British style version of an Alpha Strike. So think about it. Think of it kind of like Taranto and the attacks which take place there, but from 5 or 6 carriers launching that strike scenario. So 5 or 6 carriers launching 18 to 20 aircraft at a time, rather than a carrier launching all its aircraft in one go. That's how the British would have conducted that sort of style of operation. Now, the British have gone for this style of continuous operation because, whilst it might be not necessary in some parts of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, it will probably be necessary in the South China Sea, which they're likely to have to fight through because of the prevalence of air bases you can build in that area. And it will be necessary in the Mediterranean because the air bases are around the Mediterranean. And if you're conducting anti-submarine warfare operations using your aircraft, you're going to be doing continuous operations with those as well. So these 3 factors, and especially also reconnaissance operations, although that kind of fits in the anti-submarine warfare, operations mean continuous operation of aircraft. So you're going to have to design your carrier around continuous operation of aircraft, i.e. not build up, strike, launch, and then recover everyone, but be able to switching from launching to recovery, etc., quickly and efficiently. But the British built the armoured carrier because the limitations of the fact radar doesn't exist when it's being designed, but also the reality that, in their view, when you're within a range of enough land-based aircraft, the odds of you getting hit go very high. So you want something which is going to be able to take a punch, be easily repaired, and preferably keep working in the meantime. The Joffre class doesn't really fit that. The French designed it around the continuous air operations, and it's one of the reasons why the island is actually flush with the hull and the flight deck is canted. Again, the French going their own way, instead of canting the island out from the hull, they've canted the flight deck out from the hull. Frankly, the positioning of the lifts are more problematic for me, but leave that to one side. The whole point is it gives them theoretically a capable vessel, but it's not really practical once you go through it. It's a sort of case of, yes, it's going to have 40 aircraft, but it's not going to be particularly fast. The Joffres, again, come in at 33.5 knots, which, yes, you can point to and go, well, hang on, Alex, you said it's not particularly fast, but that's 5 knots faster than the Dunkirks. True. And it's 1.5 knots faster than the Riculus. But the trouble is, if you're operating in a fast task group with capital ships and carriers together, then you need to decide very quickly, and the British and are over this in the 1920s and especially in the 1930s when they're trying to come up with a decision of it. And as a rule, their thing is the carrier should have a proper escort, but it should also attach itself to a capital ship force if it can. The carrier can have to divert from the capital ships from their line of advance into the wind to launch and recover aircraft and then get back. The capital ships will need to keep going at their pace. So the carrier will need to have the pace to both go fast enough into the wind to launch and recover aircraft and then catch up. A 5-knot advantage will probably do it. Probably. But it's going to be hard going. A 1.5-knot advantage, well, then you're in the place of where your capital ship is going to have to go with your carrier, and your carrier's top speed is going to be limited. They might have 1.5 extra knots into the tank, but they can't do it because they've got to keep the capital ship with them. And this is then when we get to the French geostrategic position. Why is a fast task group so important? Why am I talking about this? Why am I saying the carrier is a gap in their fast task group? Surely, if they go to the Far East, they'll be operating with the Royal Navy, who'll bring their carriers along. If they're operating in the Mediterranean, we've already been over, there's going to be land-based air within range. So the Royal Navy, that's a threat, but for the French, a lot of those bases are going to be French. Well, let's deal with the global one to start with. France has a lot of area to cover. They are going to need to provide a lot of presence, but also they're also going to need to provide anti-surface radar and anti-submarine task groups. That's part of their agreement with the British, and that's part of what they're really expected to do. If you look at what they do in World War II, that's what they started getting on with. They're forming up forces, especially some joint with the British, some independent. And again, it's British carriers having to fill in for that, because the French don't have carriers. Despite them having that 37,499 tons, let's be honest, you could probably get away with 37,500 tons available. Now, how big a carrier could you build? Well, 18,750 tons in standard is going to be an interesting size, but it's doable for the French. It is doable for the French. Remember, they're the ones who are quite prepared to build what I would call shrunk capital ships. Because let's be honest, Dunkirks are not the largest vessels in the world. Not for a capital ship period where the average capital ship being built is roughly 35,000 tons. They turn around and build something of 26,000 tons. And if you're going to go and take part in defending your territories in the Far East, then again, that's something which the Japanese would have to do, the French would have to do, as the Japanese attack them. Because whilst they can rely and pretty much guarantee that if the Japanese attack them, both the British and the Americans will end up involved, simple reason that the British and the Americans can't allow the other to win the war against Japan alone, because that would then threaten their own position as a dominant power and a capable power in the Far East. They can't afford the other to do it without them. So if one of them gets involved, the other one has to get involved. The other one has to go, we will also ally. So if France gets attacked, both Britain and America will come to their aid in the Far East. That's great for the French. But the trouble is, as we all know from history with the Americans, etc., and the British, in fact, you could say more or so with the British than the Americans, but both have similar... It's kind of interesting when it comes to the Americans and the Far East, okay? They don't tend to help for free. They expect something. And if you were there not helping them at all, well, the Americans don't have an empire, but they do have a series of protectorates and interesting relations in the Far East, which they would surely like to expand, as they like to consider that side of the Pacific to be their home turf. And the British, similarly, if you don't turn up, they might go, well, perhaps we should take custody of these areas, because you obviously can't defend them, and it's better for your security if we look after it. Again, nations don't have to be nice, they don't have to have friends, they have interests. And that can make you cynical. And then we have the naval aviation in the Mediterranean. There is a small problem with all of this, and that's another reason why I find the Joffre class not being ordered to 1938, even if we consider French infrastructure, which is always interesting, but the fact is when you're just building the Dunkirks and heavy cruisers, you do have the space, you could have built some carriers at that time. You need fighter protection. It's one of the things, the British have started using fighter protection, and it's been key for their exercises, even pre-radar, using larger aircraft, tend to be torpedo spotter reconnaissance aircraft, but earlier on, as early as the Blackburn, the Royal Navy were using aircraft flying up high with observers in them, watching, using binoculars to look out and look for aircraft coming in, and then they'd signal it. The first earliest versions of airborne early warning. Pardon me. The British did use those in those exercises with the French. And the French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really couldn't do that with the Burn. The French really But that would have been really useful for air defense, because air defense at sea in the pre-missile age is not about destroying aircraft, as I've been over in several videos, and even in the aircraft carrier series where I did the French and German aircraft carriers. It is about breaking up strikes. Your fighters break up a wing, air wing, into squadrons and flights, preferably, in terms of attack groups. Your heavy AA then breaks up those squadrons and breaks up those squadrons into flights, if not into pairs of aircraft. Then your medium AA breaks up those aircraft into ones, preferably singles, maybe twos, but preferably singles. And then hopefully you manage to dodge their attack, or your light AA takes them out. And the thing is, the whole way through, the explosions, the constant attacks, all those things are wearing on the squidgy organic thing which is flying that aircraft. Which is one of the reasons why it's such a change once you've got air defense at sea against missiles. Because you'll no longer have the advantage of there being a squidgy organic thing in control of the aircraft which can feel fear. You now have something which doesn't understand the concept of fear. You have a microchip, or variations thereof of those similar control systems. And that's when it changes from a air defense system which is about breaking up strikes and taking them out if you can, but preferably, but really it's only necessary to break them up, and that's what you focus on, to actually killing your target. And that changes the whole paradigm of air defense at sea. So did they need naval aviation? I would argue they did, but I can also see the arguments for why they didn't bother. They had all these air bases ashore, which theoretically they could call on for fighter and support and strike, and they had the burn as their example, and that's just not going to generate the necessary critical mass necessary to justify naval aviation. So, the short and long answer comes back to World War I, the Normandy-class battleships, and the fact that the vessel that survives is the burn. And honestly, the burn is chosen because of World War I, because of all the effects of it. And then it itself becomes a major factor in why the French Navy doesn't evolve more. And yes, please note, they do have some really good aircraft ideas. I would say the twin-engined aircraft for the Joffre class is another thing. If the Joffres had entered service, if they'd built us a version of the Joffres earlier, and the Joffres were not going to be particularly heavy aircraft carriers, they were going to be 18,000 tons in standard, so they can obviously design a decent aircraft carrier for around 18,000. I was allocating 18,750 tons. They did it 750 tons lighter than that to get the Joffre class. You can honestly have a decent aircraft carrier on that tonnage for the French. The question is, why don't they? The French could have built that earlier, and they could have got those twin-engined aircraft that they were designing into service, and that would have been really interesting, because I think if the French had entered twin-engined aircraft into service on a carrier in, let's say, the same period as the Dunkirks, the beginning 1930s, that could have led to a revolution. I can see the British also going, "Oh, twin engines, is that the way?" And the Americans and the Japanese, and we can think about the effect on World War II if now everyone's got multi-role twin-engined aircraft which can both be fighters and bombers for their air groups. That would have been massive, and that would have been the contribution the French could do, which is it's really interesting, because they do have this idea of innovation which would have had a massive outside impact, and yet they don't invest, and it doesn't come about, and it just never happens. Which is sad. It's sad. So, ultimately, a lot of potential, but no completion. Press N. And what have we got coming up? We have a story of the First Fleet, founding of Australia. I do need to check that spelling. And we have great ships of the first, second, and third rates of the 18th century. That's going to be a fun one. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And, well, by the time this video is out, the patron suggestions for February should be live. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Oh, yes, question. I knew I was forgetting something. So, the question for this video that I'm going to ask at the end is based on the twin-engined aircraft thing. If, let's say, a hypothetical Joffre class, a slightly improved version of the Joffre class for 18,750 tons, had been built in the coming into service in parallel with Dunkirk's, and they built 2 of them, and they had got their twin-engined aircraft, what do you think would have happened? What do you think the effect on other navies would have been? Bearing in mind, of course, the Royal Navy is still dealing with the fact that the Air Ministry controls a large chunk of the procurement process for the Fleet Air Arm. The US Navy is an interesting procurement service when it comes to its aircraft, and the Japanese are the Japanese, so they could either go incredibly for it or incredibly against it. But I'd like to hear what your ideas are and what you think they might have done. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Have a nice day.